Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. Have you ever tried to make a change to something, and then just as soon as you step out or take your eyes off of it, suddenly things have returned back to the old way? It could be so frustrating. But if you've been working on a project with major improvements that you implemented, the last thing that you want is to walk away and suddenly no one follows your changes and your improvements are all gone. Well, that truly reflects the intent of the control phase in DMAIC, where we want to sustain the improvements that we put into place. One of the most effective tools to help ensure improvements are sustained is to build a control plan. So in this lesson, I'll show you what a control plan is and how you can build one. So let's dive right into defining what a control plan is.
The control plan is a defined plan that outlines all the necessary steps in order to sustain whatever improvements were just implemented. So in practice, it's going to be comprised of a one-page document that's going to define all the controls that you need in order to make sure those improvements are sustained in the new process that was just implemented or changed. So there are lots of different versions that you can use for control plan. What I'm going to show you in just a minute is going to be one example that uses a direct and simplified version of one. So who actually builds the control plan? Well, it's usually a product of the team itself, but that doesn't mean that the whole team has to be involved in the formal process of building the control plan. The team needs to at least agree on the control plan, be a complete agreement about it. But it could be built in the first place by just one or more subject matter experts or SMEs, and then later be validated and modified by the team itself. So what are the resources that you need if you're going to be building a control plan? Well, there's several items that you can use that you need to collect ahead of time to help you in building it. First off, you can use identification of the metrics that were used for the analysis itself within the project. This should include at least the project Y and any statistically significant X's that were identified. Also, any project performance goals or the voice of the customer, which is the VOC. For example, any definition of their targets or the lower upper spec limits as defined by the customer's requirements. Also, the voice of the process, or VOP, like any lower upper control limits, those could be helpful as well. And a 2B process map, or maybe value stream map, those can identify some critical steps in the process that could be helpful in building the plan. Or any Kanban system requirements, or any training documentation for like when you're implementing a new process, like standard operating procedures, or job aids, or that sort of thing. So all these types of elements would be helpful to collect ahead of time when you're ready to build the control plan.
Alright, now let me show you an example of a control plan and its various parts.
Alright, so let's look at an example of a control plan that would have at least two critical metrics that we're tracking on the plan itself. So here's an example where we have the two critical metrics, the billing quality rate and the billing cycle time. They're going to be tracking on this example, the control plan. So it starts off with first this column, which is the issue, that is, what is it that's being tracked? In this case, we might identify one of these as the Y or one as a critical X. But either way, these are what we decided as the most critical items, most critical metrics that we want to track within our control plan. Next, we identify for timing. This is where we're going to show how frequently the issue is going to be monitored. So that is, whatever issue we're looking at, in this case, whatever metrics we're looking at, this is how often we're going to be looking at it. So we need to make sure that we're defining ahead of time how frequently we're going to be monitoring that metric for this. Next, in the measure, this is referring to what tool or resource we're going to be using as a reference point for where we're going to be monitoring these particular metrics. So it could be a scorecard, or it could be a dashboard, or some other reporting from a system, or some other manual collection or sampling that's done. Either way, we need to identify what that source is that we're going to be using for tracking these issues or metrics. And next in the trigger column, this is referring to where the trigger point is when we need to take some sort of corrective action. So this is where we might use the lower spec limit or upper spec limit, or maybe a lower upper control limit. Either way, it's what would identify for us when we reach a certain point, this is what's going to trigger some sort of corrective action. So next in the owner column, who's going to be doing the monitoring and who's the one who's responsible for it? This is where we're going to track that responsible party, the one who's going to be doing the monitoring and who's going to be responsible for taking the corrective action if we happen to see the metric or issue happening to go outside of our expected limits and hitting these trigger points. And next we've got the corrective action. This is where we're going to identify whatever action is necessary when the issue is triggered. So this also could suggest some potentially known root causes, things that we might know of that could be triggering it, or maybe areas to look for trying to find the root cause. Either way, when the trigger occurs, this is where we need to take some action. These are the actions we're going to anticipate that might need to be taken when that issue is triggered. And then finally, we've got the process adjustment. This is where we're going to identify what actions or changes may need to be necessary to implement within the process in order to help prevent this issue from reoccurring. Now we're going to have to do this as best as we can at this point because we may end up finding that's a different root cause than what we might have anticipated, but either way, if it happens to be a root cause that we were planning for or expected as part of the corrective action, then we can identify here what are those necessary changes or steps we might need to take place in order to help prevent that error from occurring again.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
I'd like you to identify at least 2 different projects or initiatives that you might have worked on within your organization and ask yourself a few questions for each one. First off, was a control plan created to help sustain whatever improvements or changes were put in place? If there was a control plan that was used, then how closely was that control plan followed? And what problems occurred, if any, that were found and quickly resolved because of having that control plan already in place? But if there was not a control plan that was used, then why wasn't one used? And what are some of the critical elements that you would have added in creating a control plan? And what problems occurred, if any, that could have been avoided or possibly resolved more quickly if a control plan was used?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.